So, final beer pairing I want to do is one that you might not expect works, but it's pretty interesting. Imperial Stout with an old Canadian corn whiskey. The reason you might not think it works is Imperial Stouts are huge, thick, syrupy beers. And then you have old Canadian corn whiskey, which is very light, ethereal whiskey. So you're kind of pairing big and bold to this light, subtle whiskey. But let's give it a go and see what happens. So the stout is just, there's so much there in terms of really sharp roasted characters, not a lot of grain, lots of coffee, a good kick of bitterness, very, very thick on the palate. Now if we try, you know, an old light Canadian corn whiskey with it. So first of all, the whiskey isn't diminished at all by the Imperial Stout. So it's not like the Imperial Stout is taking on the whiskey's territory, but the whiskey is in this role, it plays out to be sweet and sharp. Like actually the sharpness that's associated with that age just slices right through the thick syrupy character of the beer. And it works really, really well. The beer still dominates because it has more flavor, but the whiskey doesn't get lost. It's really interesting. Yeah, this is one where it's maybe less about, you know, making the whiskey better on its own and making the beer better on its own, and more about the fact that together they're more than the sum of the parts, which is quite remarkable. And the final note I'll add, the Imperial Stout's interesting beside an old Canadian corn whiskey because it kind of helps you unpack the style, which can be sometimes difficult to unpack, just in terms of providing some very stark contrasts in terms of heaviness, in terms of roasted notes, in terms of even texture and bitterness, compared to something that's very different. So really interesting pairing. Maybe probably the most interesting pairing of the bunch. Not necessarily my favorite in terms of what's best. I think the porter and the rye is what I really, really find interesting, or find, I guess, really appealing. But this is something that's just a really, really neat pairing by contrast. So if you can give it a go, pretty interesting.